Hey, I have to admit something. I am a huge fan secretly, but not as big of a fan as my wife is of professional wrestling, okay? My wife always tries to get me to go to professional wrestling matches. I grew up, we did not have television, and we did not have movies, and so I didn't know much about wrestlers. My parents tried their best to keep large oiled-up men in silky yellow underwear from having an influence on my life for some reason. I don't know what the reason was, but one day, and I had my very first experience with professional wrestling at the Ohio State Fair because my grandpa was a big fan of wrestling. So my grandpa took me to watch Farmer Brown versus the Beast. Now, Farmer Brown was a farmer. He wore bib overalls. That was enough for me. I was a fan of him. You know, I was like, I grew up farming. You're a farmer. I'm on your side. The Beast wore like the wrestling singlet like Andre the Giant. If you know, you know. Shout out to the GOAT. If you know who that is, you're awesome. But you couldn't tell where the Beast wrestling singlet and his body hair turned from one into the other, right? It was just like he was just this hairy guy, and he was dirty. He did all the dirty tricks, right? And so I cheered for Farmer Brown. And that got me into starting to watch with my grandpa, who I was secret. He would tell, don't tell your mom I'm doing this. And we would watch professional wrestling. My grandpa used to sit with the remote, and he would hold on to it. And when my grandma would come in the room, he'd say, they ought not let this stuff be on television. And then he would just keep holding on to the remote and watching it. As long as my grandma heard him say it shouldn't be on television, it was okay. I became a fan of Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan. Man, and if you grew up in my generation, that man was everything. Like, he was the guy in wrestling. I was a huge fan. I would go to my grandpa's I would tell my parents, hey, I'm going to go help Grandpa with the farm. We would go to the farm and we would watch Hulk Hogan battle the Ultimate Warrior. Now, the Ultimate Warrior was my brother's favorite wrestler. The Ultimate Warrior wore like face mask paint, and he had huge flowing locks and just these massive, massive muscles. And my brother would cheer for the Ultimate Warrior, and I would cheer for Hulk Hogan. And then we would get to the house, and we would wrestle, and I would be Hulk Hogan, and I would say, let me tell you something, brother, and we would wrestle. And it was awesome. And we actually, I still do this. Isla K turned 7 today. It's her birthday. And her and I wrestle like this. And so she will say, her name is John Cena. And she will come jumping onto me. And I will say, can you smell what The Rock is cooking? And we will come in and wrestle. And it's awesome. It's awesome. I love Hulk Hogan. Huge fan. And you can learn a lot from Hulk Hogan, believe it or not. In a world full of voices, you can find value in Hulk Hogan. And what made me so excited about this sermon was recently Hulk Hogan got baptized. And I'd written the sermon before that, but I was like, oh, yeah, I can call him brother. Like, I was pumped. I was so excited. If you got a Bible, turn to Genesis chapter 32. Genesis chapter 32. We're going to read verse 22 and down through a good portion. And I will tell you that you should read the rest of this chapter on your own. Genesis, I think we could go for 2 years on Genesis. It has so many stories. And what I appreciate Genesis is that I appreciate that it doesn't try to make the founders look good. It just tells you all of their flaws. Like, it's just like, hey, these guys, they did this, and somehow God used them despite their failures. And that gives me hope for myself. But we're going to read Genesis chapter 32, verse 22. The same night he arose. He took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, his 11 children. He crossed the ford of the Jabbok River. He took them and sent them across the stream and anything else he had. And then this is where this story begins to get kind of bizarre, but also very interesting. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Now, okay. I feel like we should pause right here because there's a lot more context than just this random dude showed up and was like, you know, I'm John Cena, and, you know, and then they just start fighting. Like, there's way more context than what we're getting right here. A man wrestles with him until the breaking of the day. Verse 25, when the man saw he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day is broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. He said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. He said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men, and you have prevailed. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. I find this to be so fascinating because this man, he gets the blessing that he's been fighting for. And he's like, I don't care about that. I want to know your name. Tell me your name. And he says, please tell me your name. He says, why is it you ask my name? And there he blessed him. Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I've seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, and he limped on his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that he has in the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. What on earth does this have to do with Hulk Hogan? I know you're all asking because I asked myself that. This story is a very interesting story. Jacob wrestles this man who, by all accounts, is an absolute stranger. And he's wrestling him all night, and yet he doesn't know who he's wrestling. Now, when I thought of that, when I read this, I thought, oh, that's just like the story of Hulk Hogan, because back in the day, Hulk Hogan had these many different wrestlers that he would fight against. Right? He had this guy named the Ultimate Warrior who was like his rival. And then towards the end, he would wrestle The Rock, and he would wrestle, and he'd have these big rivalries, and I would get all amped up. I'm like, he's wrestling the Warrior. The Warrior's a cheater. I would get all fired up, and they would come out and wrestle. But what the Hulk never really knew, secretly, behind the shadows, there was really another wrestler named The Brain. And The Brain was the one who was actually fighting Hulk the entire time. What The Brain would do is The Brain would get behind the scenes and he'd say to the Hulk, do you know what the Ultimate Warrior said about you? And then he'd go over to the Ultimate Warrior and he'd say, do you hear what the Hulk said about you? And they would get mad and they would fight each other, and the Hulk Hogan never actually knew the entire time who he was really fighting against. He thought he was fighting one person, and really he was fighting another. In this story, Jacob thinks he's fighting one person, but he's really fighting God. And this should not be a surprise to us because Jacob has been fighting people since conception. In fact, in his mother's womb, she said, it feels like there's two nations at war with me. Jacob was conceived fighting. He was always fighting. In fact, when Jacob was born, he's born holding the ankle of his brother. He's trying to get him in an arm bar, like he's trying to bust a UFC move on him. And his brother's born, and Jacob comes out holding on to his leg. He's always been somebody who's fighting. You realize about Jacob, he's born fighting Esau. He even attempts and succeeds at deceiving his own parents. He uses his mother to deceive his father. He tricks his brother out of certain things. He finally has to flee for his life because he's caused so much drama and controversy. He runs into a man named Laban. He falls in love. He tries to get married. And for the rest of the time he's with Laban, he's in a fight with Laban. Like you read through Genesis, he's always in some drama. In fact, it actually makes sense that he's going to wrestle someone right here because he's just left fighting with Laban. He just fled from Laban. And then they got together and they made a peace treaty. And the reason he's fighting this man now is he was fighting Laban, and he's on his way to what he thinks is a fight with Esau. So when you know that, the story begins to make sense. Jacob is always wrestling someone. He's never not trying to control and wrestle and fight for the situation, so much so that he doesn't recognize God because he's so obsessed with fighting everyone. Now, this Leviathan is a word that means, it means that it is a spiritual creator of or agent of chaos. In other words, it is like what Satan does is he supernaturally creates chaos in your life, and he tries to attempt to destroy you through chaos, chaos, chaos.